Hey everyone, Dreki here, and for today's Side-by-Side Sunday, we're comparing two real 4K cameras from ThiEYE, the T5 Edge and the T5e. These two cameras may have similar names, but they couldn't be more different in terms of internal components. The T5 Edge is based on an Akaso V50 processor and a Panasonic sensor, while the T5e is based on an Umbrella processor and a Sony sensor. Both do real 4K at 30 frames per second, and they each have their own strengths and weaknesses, so my goal with this video is to help you decide which would work best for you if you're comparing these two cameras. Let's start with the unboxing. It's been a while since I unboxed the T5e, but I remember it came with two batteries and less accessories overall, whereas the Edge comes with a few more clips but only one battery. In terms of build quality, the cases of these two cameras are almost identical save for the orange markings on the Edge. From the back, the sides, the bottom, and the top, these two cameras are completely identical, and they even take the same waterproof case and batteries. The biggest difference between these two cameras comes when you turn them on. First off, the screen on the Edge is a little bit dimmer than the one on the E. They do both have good viewing angles though. The user interface of the Edge is way better than the E. To show you what I mean, I'm going to count the number of clicks that it takes to change the video resolution from 4K to 1080p. That's quite a straightforward thing and something I regularly do during my reviews. On the Edge, you hit the up arrow to enter the video settings menu, hit the down arrow, record button, down 2 more times, record, and then menu, for a total of 7 clicks. On the E, it takes 19 clicks to do the same simple task. You have to cycle through the photo mode, through playback, then scroll past 10 different video resolutions, most of which an average user is not going to ever need. And it gets worse when you want to change other settings because the menu is one long list. So there's no separate menu for camera settings like ISO or other things that you'd want to quickly change on the fly. The Edge, on the other hand, has its menus cleanly broken into different sections for video settings, photo settings, and camera settings, so it is far easier and takes less clicks to find what you're looking for. The options that the Edge has are more basic, to be fair, and that means it is missing several customization options that the E has. The Edge does not have settings for sharpness, mic volume, field of view, all of which the E does have, but is buried in the long list. So now let's talk about video quality, and here is where both cameras' strengths and weaknesses become apparent. Both of these cameras offer real 4K at 30 frames per second, but there is one key difference. The Edge has stabilization at 4K, where the E does not. The E excels, however, in 1080p 60 and 1080p 120, where it has far more detail than the Edge. If you want higher resolution and don't care about frame rates, the Edge is the cam for you. But if you plan on using 1080p 60 primarily, you'll probably be better off with the E. Since we've got the Edge on the left, let's talk about where it's best first, high resolution modes. Mounted on my bike handlebars, these cameras have to deal with a lot of bumps and shaking, and side by side like this, it's a little bit hard to see the difference, so let's look at one clip at a time. The Edge in 4K has a decent amount of detail, although perhaps slightly less than the E. I find that it also has a little bit of compression artifacts in smooth gradients like the sky and the clouds. Let's take a close look at each camera individually now. At half speed, you can see that the footage looks pretty damn good, but if you're on a big 4K screen, you may see some compression noise in the form of blocks or a slight lack of smoothness in the gradients. Some of that will be from YouTube, but some of that is definitely from the camera. The Edge also has a little bit of noise up close, but unless you're looking at it on a 4K screen, you probably won't see it. So now let's compare this to the E. Footage from the E has slightly more detail. It's such a small difference though that you would need to freeze and zoom in to 100% to see it, or be watching on a real 4K screen, but if you take a close-up look, check out the trees in the distance. The Edge is just a little bit more smudgy, and where you can make out some details on the E, especially around the branches, the stems, on the Edge, often you cannot. The difference in actual resolution is kind of a moot point though, because unless the E is mounted on a tripod or placed on a stable surface like a table, the video from it is less useful overall than the Edge, thanks to stabilization. Check out the difference between stabilized and unstabilized footage and you'll see what I mean. Also, I noticed while filming this that the Edge stays way cooler than the E. The E gets hot at 4K resolution. The winner in high resolution to me is the Edge, just because it has the stabilization, and if you don't like the stabilization, you can always turn it off. Let's flip things around now and look at 1080p video, where the E is the clear winner. The difference in the amount of detail the two cameras resolve is startling, with the E being far sharper. It's almost as if the Edge is actually shooting video in 720p and then upscaling to 1080p. As per usual, we'll start with the Edge up close. The video isn't terrible, mind you, far from the worst 1080p 60 I've ever seen. It is a true 60 frames per second, so it can be slowed down to half speed and still be reasonably smooth, but check out the grass and the pathway compared to the E. It is also a true 60 frames per second in daylight, but it also resolves real 1080p, and the difference is just mind-blowing. The E also has advantages in slow motion modes that the Edge does not. The E shoots 2.7K at 60 frames per second, 1080p at 120 frames per second, and 720p at 240 frames per second. Quite frankly, if the Edge had stabilized 2.7K 60, it would be the perfect camera for me, but you know, I can dream. Having the option, even if it is not stabilized, is nice though, because it can be used on a gimbal or on a flat surface or with a proper stabilizer, whereas with the Edge you don't really have much in the way of usable high frame rate modes. Anyways, the point of this section was to say that if you want slow motion or you plan on using 1080p 60, then the E is probably the better camera for you, but if you want higher resolution with stabilization, then the Edge is the better choice. Speaking of higher resolution, on the Edge, both the 4K and 2.7K modes are 60 megabits per second, so I prefer the 2.7K mode because there's less compression. I think that this is the best mode on the camera and one of the best modes on any camera I've tried, so let's step down to 2.7K mode for the rest of this comparison. I'll be using the 1080p 60 on the E, so you don't have to suffer that one without stabilization. We'll take a close-up look at the Edge first of all. The Edge does a decent job with stabilization, and although it's not as powerful as some high-end cameras, it's quite good for the price. It maintains smoothness and a good amount of detail without a loss of resolution. The video stays flat even when bumping downstairs, and the stabilization distortion is well corrected so there's little wobble on the edges. And now let's see the E. Remember that the E is in 1080p 60 mode, so it may not be as sharp as the Edge. The stabilization on the E is pretty good too, but I find the Edge to be just a little bit more powerful. Which one do you think is better? Let me know in the comments below. It's difficult to say which camera renders more accurate color. I think that the Edge consistently pushes a bit more towards a warm yellow, which you can see on the concrete compared to the E, which is a little bit more of a cool, neutral color. At this point, it's basically preference. The Edge is a little bit more vibrant than the E. As well, it's definitely warmer in many situations, like I said. The Edge is the clear winner though in terms of dynamic range. There were several times that I felt the Edge looked overall better, especially when there was a lot of contrast in the scene, like during bright daylight. Check out the cloud in the top right, for example. The Edge has detail almost throughout the entire cloud, whereas on the E it's a big, bright splotch. Low light is also kind of a toss-up between the two cameras. In some situations, the Edge is a little bit brighter, but as it gets darker and darker out, both cameras get a little bit smudgy due to the noise reduction. In dark situations, the stabilization on both cameras becomes ineffective. The Edge can get brighter overall than the E, but it's also at the expense of detail. For most people, either camera will be good enough, but my personal preference sways slightly towards the Edge just because it starts out brighter. Audio quality between the two cameras can only be compared with some audio samples, so I'll show you those in a moment. The Edge just got a new firmware update that promises improved audio quality, and I have to say, I did notice the difference between the new firmware and the old one, but I still don't find it as clear as the E. Check out the difference. Just do a little bit of a walking test here. As I'm walking and talking, you can get an idea of how the cameras handle stabilization when somebody's walking and trying to hold them still. If I wasn't trying to hold them still, it would be a little bit shakier. but I'm not exactly the most stable at this, so it's a good idea. Let's try running. How about that? Maybe get a good idea of what it looks like when somebody's doing that. And back towards the sun, see what both cameras look like. So what you just heard was a sample from the old firmware on the ThiEYE T5 Edge. This is what the new firmware sounds like. The old firmware tended to peak and crackle a little bit, but I find this firmware has a slightly lower volume overall. Now this is audio from the ThiEYE T5e in the exact same situation. I'm holding it right beside the T5 Edge, so they should be picking up about the same volume. I find that the T5e tends to be a lot clearer overall, and easier to understand voices even in the waterproof case. Still photos? Well, again, this is going to be based on your preference. They're both a little bit smudgy when viewed at 100%, but zoomed out for print, on screen, anything like that, it's totally fine. If you prefer the brighter and more dynamic colors of the Edge, and you can put up with the slightly smudgy details, it's better overall. But if you prefer the sharpness and the way that the E resolves details, then, well, that's the camera you're going to go for. I'm going to leave this one as a tie. Well, I tried my best to make this video not confusing, but it's kind of difficult since the two cameras have such similar names. It looks like for most situations I prefer the Edge a little bit more though, which was a huge surprise to me. I love the E and I've used that camera extensively throughout the summer and even in the fall here. But the only things I really think the E are better at is its audio and high frame rate modes. The menu is a pain in the butt on the E, and that makes it just not as pleasant to use as the Edge. It seems like the hunt for a perfect budget 4K camera is still on. I'd be happiest with a mashup of these two cameras, to be honest. The 1080p 60 mode from the E, the stabilization at high resolutions from the Edge, the menus from the Edge, the audio quality from the E. It seems like when buying one of these cameras, you just need to take into account what each camera is best at and figure out what you want to prioritize. A lot of cameras have some trade-offs that some people could live with but other people can't. Some people want better audio, other people want higher resolutions, and just do your research. They're not perfect, but each release is getting closer and closer to that balance of performance and price. Hey, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and let me know which camera you like best. Hey everyone, Dreki here, and for today's Side by Side Sunday we're comparing the ThiEYE T5e and the ThiEYE T5 Edge.